welcome to those who are just joining us for our November session. We're going to have a little bit of fun talking about the small business restructure, which has become quite a popular conversation point we've found over the last month or so. But before we get into that, just a couple of things for a reminder. For most of you, you would be aware that the Director ID needs to be in place by the 30th of November. So we've had nearly a 12-month transition period. And as always, we're 20 days out, and I think there's a lot of people who still haven't done their Director IDs. So if you, I'm sure everyone listening, Phil, will have themselves all completely organised, but trying to manage their clients is a whole different kettle of fish.
Like trying to herd cats, mate.
The other thing I wanted to mention, more on the insolvency side, is that we are definitely seeing an increase in legal action starting to flow through the courts now. We've certainly had a number of wind-up applications starting to come into play, where probably 2 months ago we weren't really seeing any of that, particularly from the ATO. They're certainly not near their pre-pandemic levels, but their propensity and desire to actually start doing that is quite clear now, and we're starting to see that come through the courts. I think, just in the last fortnight, we've had 2 clients that are coming with wind-up applications. And quite interestingly, that's on the back of them having payment plans earlier. So the big thing that that's really starting to become prevalent across the country is that people entered into payment plans earlier in the year when the offers were there and the ATO was being very generous. They've not been able to meet those payment plans. Quite often, director penalty notices have been issued and dealt with seemingly through the payment plan, thinking that everything was going to be okay. And now, on top of having to deal with wind-up applications, we're also having to look at personal bankruptcy a lot more significantly because of that payment plan action that happened earlier. And again, there's still a lot of hope out there that things are going to change. That sentiment doesn't seem to have dropped off as yet, even though the talk of recessions and interest rate rises and all the rest of it are putting that in there. People were still doing payment plans, trying to deal with the DP industry paying it, but now we're finding that we're now having to do a lot more strategies, as we always do, a very holistic approach, but we are now got a lot more bankruptcy stuff that we're talking about, that we're seeing. So I think that need to get specific director advice and not just company advice is even more critical now. And Phil, you and I know that we spend our entire life saying that getting that holistic advice is critical.
Yeah.
But I think it's even more so now that we're starting to see the impact of a lot of this flowing through personally. So as advisors to clients in trouble, be really mindful of who you send people to, making sure that they can give both corporate and personal advice, not just one or the other. Because if you don't put those pieces together, it can become very, very ugly. And the other thing is probably more of an opinion piece, I guess, Phil, that I wanted to bring up. I like having an opinion every now and again, but no,
really?
Never as strong as yours. But one thing I have been reading a little bit lately is looking at something that came up in articles was around the home equity. And I found it a really interesting article. A lot of conversations I've been having with people is that the economy doesn't make sense at the moment. We've got rising interest rates, cost of living, everything's going up, but there still appears to be plenty of money in the economy. And some of the older people with grey hair like you and I would remember the CBA ran a promotion good 15, 20 years ago around equity, mate. Yep. And found this interesting article that actually talked about in the 12 months to June 2021, in the Australian market alone, there had been $93 billion withdrawn from equity in homes.
It's a lot of money.
So that's a lot of coin. And when you think about that, how big the stimulus package was at 150 billion. On top of that, we've had another 93 billion coming out of people's homes. Now, with the property market that's been going nuts, there's just this massive draw of money that people can take out. The numbers this year, according to the articles, are showing that there's been a further 14.9% rise in the drawings from equity. And although the official numbers that are coming out haven't been released yet, that would make it about another $110 billion have come out of home equity in the last 12 months. So when we're talking about managing and looking after small businesses, one of the big comments in the article was how much of it was actually being brought out to prop up small business for funding capital into small businesses. So two things that I really wanted to highlight. One is that now that the property market's starting to stabilise or constrict, interest rates are going up, borrowing against that equity is going to get harder. So therefore, funding small business and funding household consumption is going to get harder. So that's one issue that I think will actually constrict our market in time. Not that I'm an economist at any high level. This is, again, an opinion piece. The other thing, and more importantly, I guess, is something that you and I harp on all the time about, Phil, and that is the fact that if people are pulling money out of their home to put into their business, please ensure that there are PPSR charges in place. I think over the 2.5 years that we've been doing these webinars, it's and when we're doing the live presentations as well, we talk about it all the time. But when you talk about in the last 2 years, there's been $200 billion withdrawn from people's homes to put into business. How critical that is. And it's not all into business, I should be clear. Not all of that 200 billion's gone into business, but whatever amount it is, just as advisors, just a gentle reminder again, that if you're seeing that money going in, please ensure that they are putting charges in place. It is very powerful if the world turns on its head and a business gets into trouble. If you're not sure what it means, pick up the phone to one of our strategists Australia-wide. We'll talk you through it. We can give you access to the right people to put those charges in place, or we can put look at some protection strategies that are needed. So they're the bits and pieces that I wanted to cover off before we got started, Phil.
We've been doing these 2.5 years, mate.
Sorry, buddy.
We've been doing these 2.5 years.
About that, yeah. So I think the very first one was a lot less slick and organised when I did it on my own in the bedroom in about April of 2020. We started webinars. Right. So you might need to just pick up your volume a bit, mate, or just have a look at your microphone because you're very light on. Yeah, so anyway, there were a couple of things I just wanted to raise with people before we got stuck into our topic today. I'll hand over to you, Phil, so you can have your fun of grilling me about small business restructures.
So small business debt restructuring it is. Now I'll kick off by giving our audience a little bit of background on what it is and what it's about. So the Corporations Amendment Corporate Insolvency Reform Act 2020 came into effect on the 1st of January 2021. That was heralded as the biggest change in insolvency laws in Australia for over 30 years. It brought in these debt restructuring agreements and a simplified liquidation process. Now, it was introduced to reduce the costs and make it simpler and easier to give small companies more options so that they had the same sort of options that large companies like Channel 10 or Virgin Airlines might have had. That all sounds pretty good, Ashley. What does it mean in the real world?
So I guess one of the reasons why, and before I even get into the real world stuff, is one of the things I did want to say for everyone is the reason why we brought this topic back up again is that I think in the last 2 or 3 months, we've had a lot of conversations with clients who are saying that they're getting the advice that they should be using this small business restructure. Now, whether it is the right thing or not is a whole different question, and we'll go into that today. Yeah. But for some of you, you might have heard us talk about this one before. The reason why we brought it up again is simply that there seems to be segments of the market that are over promoting this as the be all and end all. So we wanted to give everyone a bit of clarity around where it can be useful and where it can't be. So back to your question, what does it all mean? The small business restructure is really just a formal negotiation with unsecured creditors. So yeah, we've often talked about doing debt restructures. This is a formal way of doing a bit of a debt restructure for a business. It doesn't affect any of the positions of secured creditors. So this is purely around dealing with the unsecured creditors. Secured creditors' rights are still secured through this process. One of our strategists nicknamed this the Aldi docker.
Yeah.
So for the deed of company arrangement, the voluntary administration deed of company arrangement process, which is about compromising the debt as well, can be a very expensive process. So this is the Aldi version of it. So it's been nicknamed around the office that way. It is very similar to the deed of company arrangement process, but there are a number of significant differences that we'll go through today around it. But if successful, it will compromise all the unsecured debts of a company, and that could be at a cents in the dollar rate, or just a fixed amount of money thrown out.
Okay. So can any company attempt a small business debt restructure, Ashley?
And I'm sure you're just here to try and make my life a little bit trickier. It's small business.
Yeah.
So obviously it's only for small businesses. It's designed for companies that have debts of less than $1 million in total.
So when you consider that includes all tax debt, trade creditors, any bank debt, everything, it's got to be under $1 million. So that might sound like a lot, but it's actually pretty small.
Yeah.
Are there any other eligibility criteria, Ashley?
Yeah, one of the key things is the director needs to say up front that they are insolvent or that they believe that they will become insolvent. So it is a declaration that the director needs to make, and that can have some ramifications. All tax lodgements need to be up to date. They don't need to be paid, obviously, if there's debts outstanding, but they do need to be lodged. And the other critical one is that all employee entitlements must be up to date, including superannuation.
Okay.
So if you've got outstanding long service leave, that doesn't need to be paid because it's not due and payable at this point, but anything that's due and payable must be paid. And that can actually be a significant hurdle for someone to qualify for this, particularly when they're getting a little bit behind, because super is one of those things that often drops off. And there's a minor one in there that you can't have done it in the last 7 years, but given that it's only 2 years old, or not even 2 years old yet, that's not a real big issue at this point.
Yeah, but in future it might be, and that means that the company and any of its directors cannot want to done one of these in 7 years.
Yeah.
All right, Ash. So that's a bit of the mechanics of it. How does the process start?
Well, before we get into the process, Phil, I think it's really critical to understand, like I mentioned before, that it's a tool. This is one of a number of options that someone who's in trouble can use. So making sure that you identify that whether this is actually the right tool or not. We've actually found it to be not. I think this is a fantastic tool, but it doesn't actually fit requirements as often as people would think it does. So it's really important to get that advice that looks at it holistically across company and individual first. Getting that independent advice, making sure that it covers off on all the requirements, and we'll talk through some of the issues that we've seen where it's not done right first. So, but it is something. Getting that advice first as to whether it's the right tool is critical before you even start getting into the process.
All right, Ashley, I think that's a great point. Now, let's say I've spoken to someone clever like your good self, and we've all agreed that this is the best, going to get me the best outcome or gives me an opportunity to achieve a really good outcome. How does it all kick off?
Well, it starts with the appointment of a small business restructuring practitioner. And the restructuring practitioner needs to make notification to ASIC within 2 days of their appointment.
Okay, so a small business restructuring practitioner. Who can do that? Can anybody do it?
Well, it's actually a new role that was created under the legislation. So when that started, they've automatically allowed all registered liquidators to be a small business restructuring practitioner.
Okay.
But for the first time in insolvency rules, they've actually allowed others to nominate themselves to be a small business restructuring practitioner as well.
Right.
So accountants or lawyers who want to specialise in this area. So if we've got any people online that want to change out of tax and want to become a restructurer, they can actually apply to do that and then get recognised by ASIC as a practitioner.
Okay.
But as a general rule, registered liquidators are the main ones that have got it.
All right. So it all kicked off on the 1st of January 2021. What's the history of small business restructures been so far, Ash?
Well, it's been a little bit of a slow progression, would be the simplest way to put it, I guess. In 2021, there were nearly 6,000 administrations, which included voluntary administrations, liquidations, court liquidations, and small business restructures. Of that, there were only 33 companies that actually availed themselves in 2021 of the SBR system. Interestingly, of those 33, 27 of those proposals got voted up and got accepted. So it was really good uptake in terms of sign off. But I think the original idea that there were going to be thousands of these when the government put it in place right in the middle of the pandemic probably didn't achieve that. Now, I think it's quite clear why in hindsight, because we ended up with a whole extra year of COVID.
Yeah.
There's been no pressure on businesses to pay their debts. Certainly in 2021 there wasn't, and even the majority of 2022, I think people have got away with a lot that they wouldn't normally have. So without that pressure to push to actually think about more significant options, no one's had the need to.
Okay. So I don't need a calculator to tell me that 33 out of 6,000 is not a real big percentage. But
no, it's not.
What's the recent experience and trends in this area been though?
Yeah, so it is. We're starting to see the uptick this year. So in August, there were 39 appointments, and then there were another 37 in September of this year. So I mean, you had more in 1 month than we did in a whole year of 2021. So there's been a significant increase in that. So yeah, it's quite a large uptick in it.
I think we've got someone with their microphone on. Natalie, if I could just ask you to mute whoever's got their mic going. All right.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So yeah, a really significant uptick in it then, Ashley, if you look at it that way.
Yeah.
So that tool that you've got in the toolkit, it might start getting used a little bit more often than it has been in the past.
Yep.
Let's say I was a company director and I was looking at doing something like this. What's it going to cost me to appoint one of these business restructuring practitioners?
Look, it's as long as a piece of string, I guess. It depends. I mean, the number isn't specific to the legislation, so there's still varying numbers depending on the complexity, how many creditors there are, all those type of things come into play. But one of the requirements under the legislation, I think I've muted the person who was unmuted. So sorry about that, folks. But the legislation does require a fixed fee. So one of the key things is making sure that you're negotiating that correctly at the start of the process, and making sure that you try and minimise the cost that's going to be put on the restructuring practitioner. Again, by having that right advice and the right structure in place before you start.
Well, you can add a lot of value there just by getting the right fee and the right person up front to do it for you. So if I wanted to proceed, I need to declare that the company's insolvent or soon will be insolvent, and I need to meet those other eligibility criteria. Then I appoint a small business restructuring practitioner. Let's talk about how it works, Ash. Let's say I do that. Do I lose control of the company on that day?
Well, and again, this is a really significant change in the Australian insolvency regime, is that this is the first time we've actually got a system that actually is a debtor in possession model.
Right.
And what that means is that the director actually still remains in control of the day-to-day operations of the business. But for those who wouldn't be familiar with the detail of it, under the voluntary administration deed of company arrangement structure, the voluntary administrator takes over control of the company. Now, they may employ the director to continue to run the business for them, but all decisions need to be signed off by the administrator. In this model, that's not the case. The practitioner is not responsible for the day-to-day running of the business. They don't even need to make decisions or sign off on the day-to-day running. The director continues to remain in control during the whole process. What they can't do though is that the director doesn't have the ability to do things that are outside the normal course. So they need to get approval from the practitioner for things that are outside the normal course.
So that is a really significant difference to the voluntary administration system.
Yeah.
What sort of things might be considered outside the normal course that the practitioner would need to approve?
Things like signing off the sale of the business. So if the business was being sold to a third party, if there is a asset like there's a spare truck or a lorry or something sitting out there that they can sell to use money to fund whatever the offer may be, or the payment of dividends. And the dividends is actually an interesting one because there are a lot of directors who get paid by drawings, not by salary, and they get called dividends at the end of the year. But they would lose their ability to get paid under a dividend unless the practitioner signs off on that.
So no ripping out a heap of dividends and trying to do one of these. So it's good that it's a debtor in possession model. They stay in control, even though I appoint the practitioner. What else happens when that small business restructuring practitioner gets appointed?
Well, bringing up one of our favourite topics, director penalty notices, it is an option to avoid non-lockdown director penalty notices. So, again, we've talked about director penalties ad nauseum on our webinars, but it's one of the four options, or one of the options is a voluntary administration, liquidation, or a small business practitioner being appointed. So if you have, or pay it. Yeah. So it is one of those four options, which is a critical one when you get someone does get a director penalty notice within the 21 days. It also puts a stay on all creditors of taking action. So it puts a blanket of protection around the business for a period of time and puts that stay on creditors. It also puts a stay on the enforcement against personal guarantees during that period.
Okay.
Which is a really critical benefit when you're really trying to just take a breath. You're worried about losing your home. Everything's just got that stay on it for a period of time, so you can come up with some plans. The other thing is that in some cases, secured creditors won't have the ability to repossess equipment.
Okay.
So if the equipment is critical to the ongoing trading of the business, they're required to go into effectively a stay as well. Right. And they have to hold out their time. One of the big exceptions to that is if a supplier is trying to take back perishable goods or things like that.
All right.
So where it would die on the vine in the meantime.
Well, that's good, actually. It's a stay on proceedings, gets you a little bit of time. You can draw a breath and have a think about what you're going to do. How much time are we talking about?
So the process, once appointed, there's 20 business days are required for, 20 business days are given for the director to come up with an offer that the practitioner will then present to the creditors.
Okay.
They can extend that by 10 days in certain circumstances, but for the main purpose, talk about it as a 20-day cycle.
All right. So legal action is suspended. Creditors can't chase the guarantors, and you've got 20 business days to make an offer after you appoint the practitioner.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the offer. What sort of offer could it be? Like, is it payment of cents on the dollar or something like that?
Yeah, well, it can be as imaginative as you want, really, to get the creditors up. So cents on the dollar, It can be tied to a legal case if it needs to be. It can be tied to the sale of an asset. It can be a lump sum payment that's paid within a short period of time. The other thing that we are seeing with it is actually payment in full, but just giving everyone some time. So I think the creditor pressure, people have actually forgotten how it is to manage creditors sometimes, I think. And we've now got a position where, some of the clients that have come to us have said, I want to pay everyone. I just need some time to do it. So it can be a payment over time. Under the legislation, it's a maximum of 3 years that payment plan can be.
Okay. So the small business restructuring practitioner will help put the offer together, and I assume they'd assess that it's going to be better for creditors than if the company went into liquidation?
Yes, they'll help the director to put the offer together, but no, they won't do the assessment like we're used to. So they won't do the assessment as to whether it's better than in liquidation.
Right.
They only have to assess if the business can afford to pay the payment plan that's being offered.
Now, again, that's quite different to the voluntary administration deed of company arrangement process that some of our audience may be familiar with. Can you just run us through the issue, what the difference is?
Yeah, so under the full-blown VA process, the administrator needs to do a significant report, and that report effectively says, if I put the company into liquidation, this is what the return to creditors will be. And then they compare it to what a director may or someone may offer under a deed of company arrangement. And then what they have to do in their final report to creditors is that they need to show that comparison, talk about whether it's better for the creditors to take one or the other, and make a recommendation as to which way they should vote.
Right.
They don't need to do that in the small business restructure.
But hang on, how do creditors know then that the offer that's being made is better than they would get if they simply pursue the company into liquidation?
Technically, they don't.
Okay.
They don't get that level of information. And again, I mean, the report alone is a very expensive part. So this is designed to be for the small end of town, for smaller businesses. More sophisticated creditors, and I'll give you one of the big examples that we're seeing is that the ATO is asking for a version of the liquidation versus offer report, and particularly in the case where there's liquidation. So sophisticated creditors have been able to put a bit of extra pressure on, but the legislation doesn't require it.
Right.
But ATO obviously generally are the bigger voters, so they have a little bit of power if you want their vote. But smaller ones, the practitioner's only requirement under the legislation is to determine whether it's affordable or not, or whether it can be paid.
All right. So the director puts together an offer within 20 business days of the appointment of the small business restructuring practitioner.
Yep.
No assessment really required by the practitioner, but they may provide some information if called upon to do so by the ATO, for example.
Yep.
What happens then?
So then they present a report saying that this is the offer that's been made and their comment as to the affordability of it and whether it can be achieved. And that's done all virtually. So there are no meetings in the small business restructure process. Okay. So they'll send that out by electronic means. The creditors will have 15 business days to review that information and to provide their vote back electronically as to whether they accept or reject the offer being made.
Let's talk a little bit about who can vote, Ash. Like who can vote and how does it work?
So firstly, only those creditors that provide satisfactory proof of evidence that their debt actually exists will be entitled to vote. So not only do they need to send their vote back, but they've got to prove their vote along the way. Only those creditors that exercise their right to vote actually have a say. Okay. What's really interesting in a lot of these cases is that most people don't actually even bother sending their vote back. You can have 40 creditors in these things and there might only be 7 votes that come back.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Count.
Yeah.
but even if you don't vote, you're still caught by the legislation. So if it does get up, then you're caught by it whether you voted or not.
Okay.
Now the other interesting one is that they've taken out related parties as an ability to vote in these things. So it's meant to be designed to be independent creditors, not related parties that have any power.
Hang on a minute. Related parties can't vote. That's
No.
very different to voluntary administration and a deed of company arrangement again.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They can vote in there, can't they, on a DOCA?
Yeah, they can. Yeah. So whether it's the director, his loan accounts, or whether it's related party or related companies, they all have a power and a right to vote. Yeah.
So how do they determine now under this process whether you're a related party or not? What's the rules?
So given the legislation's only new and there's still only a few that have gone through it, it is a very strict rule under the legislation of ownership and control. So effectively, if the director of the company is a director of a similar of another company, then that will be deemed a related party. But if their wife, there has already been some legal cases where the wife would normally be deemed a related party in normal conversation, but for the purpose of the small business restructure, if the wife is the director of a company that is a creditor, that can actually still vote. So it's a very strict, fine rule. We anticipate over the next 2 or 3 years that there'll be a few more legal cases around that. But at the moment, that's where it stands, as a very strict statute.
It's really interesting. Okay, so now we're at the point that there'll be a vote by creditors. How does that work?
So again, it's different to the VA DOCA process. There's only one vote, and it's the vote on the dollar amount only. So there's no vote on the numbers, and it's only those creditors that actually turn up and vote. So if they don't vote, they don't have a say. So, and the other interesting part in this is the small business restructure practitioner doesn't have a casting vote because there's only one vote. So it purely just comes down to a dollar. If the creditors that vote for it vote 50.01%, then it gets up, and that's it. Yeah.
Right. So if a majority by dollar value approved, the proposal successful, and the debts are compromised for the amount of the offer.
Yep.
Company pays the amount or complies with the terms of the proposal, and that deals with the company debt, right? Compromised.
Yep.
What happens if you don't get 50.01? What happens if it goes down?
Well, this is again a really interesting one because it's a debtor in possession model. The director's still running the company, so if the vote falls over, the practitioner packs up his suitcase and he wanders off into the distance, and the director's still got his company that he's running day to day.
Okay.
Now the director has declared in the process that he was likely to become insolvent or has become insolvent. The director has told all its creditors that he's in trouble by going into this process originally. So he potentially puts himself in a really compromised position, he or she, which will probably lead to him having to make another appointment into a liquidation process.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but it's not automatic like under the VA process.
Yeah. Again, another very interesting difference.
Yeah.
As long as the offer gets accepted, though, mate, everything's fine. Hey, we're all good. We agree.
You know that's a loaded question, Phil. What it does do is when the offer is accepted, all your unsecured creditors are dealt with and they're captured through the company. But the stay on enforcement of personal guarantees stops.
Okay.
So if you've got a creditor that does have a personal guarantee, you've compromised the debt at 50 cents in the dollar, that creditor still has a right to go after the director personally under their PG for the rest of their money. So all of that stay stuff goes away, and they can start pursuing under the guarantees. And because the guarantee is a separate legal document, it's not court.
All right. So maybe not all fine then, Ash. Can we talk a little bit about personally guaranteed creditors, mate?
Yeah, well, firstly, obviously, it's only the unsecured debts of the company that are resolved.
Mm,
As I mentioned, personal guarantees are a separate agreement so that they can continue to be enforced after the process is over.
mm.
And like, again, we've talked about 100 times, is that a lot of these personal guarantees actually have caveatable interest clauses in them. And once the SBR process is finished, they can enforce under those.
Horrible things, caveatable interest. I hate them.
They're not our favourite toys, no.
So even if the company deals with the debt, the guarantor remains liable. What about secured creditors? What happens there? There's no need to worry about that, is there?
Yeah, well, again, in theory, the answer is no, there shouldn't be. Their debt is secured. As long as you continue to pay them, everything should just go on as normal with secured debts. But unfortunately, that's not always the way secured creditors play, because you've put up your hand and said, I've had a problem. I've now, I might have solved it if it's been accepted. But we are starting to see some secured creditors going, I don't want to support you anymore. So please go and find another home. Now, finding another home when you've already declared all this other stuff can make it a little bit tricky to refinance. But in theory, nothing should happen. But the reality is that it does. We have seen already some things like that starting to happen.
Okay. Now, actually, we spoke earlier about some of the things that the small business restructuring practitioner will do and some of the things that they won't do.
Yep.
So just to recap, they don't assess the potential return in liquidation. They don't make a recommendation about the offer to creditors, and they don't ever vote on the proposal. It's just a simple dollar majority vote.
Yep.
What else might they not do?
Well, their focus is on the company and the company's debts. So they're not going to have a look at any of the personal flow-on impacts that might come through to the director or their family. And because for them, it's a flat fee. So they're there to do a specific function and then get out of the way.
Fair enough, too.
Yeah. So it's so they have a very limited view, and because it is meant to be at a reduced cost, they have limited scope for how much work they can put into something.
So they're not going to think about the director's situation. They're probably not going to think about those relationships with creditors along the way either, are they?
Well, that's an interesting one. So that whole what happens after their vote gets up is, creditors, whether they're going to actually provide, they're going to supply goods in the new environment. Again, we talk about the fact that a lot of these creditors don't actually vote. So then you go, here, I want to get some more goods out of you. And they go, well, no, you already, you cut me off at the knees with my last one.
Yeah.
Why would I work with you again? So a lot of those things aren't dealt with. The impact of the personal guarantees aren't dealt with. One of the other really interesting ones that we came across probably about 2 months ago is that someone did an SBR. We weren't involved in the SBR. And here's the lesson in this on its own. What they didn't realise was that it had an impact on their building licence.
Okay.
But the SBR, when they asked about that, I said, well, that's not out. We're just worried about the company debts. So looking at all those tentacles that flow out is actually really critical to deciding whether you go with an SBR or not. Creditors, I think, is going to be a big one. A lot of them don't want to support afterwards. So you've got a plan to have new suppliers come into play and all that sort of thing to deal with it. Or people are going to be cash up front.
All right. So let's just put that into a little bit of real world context about what that means in our world. And all I'd say to you, does it do any good to deal with all of the company's unsecured debts if the director loses his house or her house?
Well, obviously the answer is no.
No. So what do you need to think about when you're doing one of these? And you've already touched on a few of the things, but just to wrap it up, to draw it together.
Again, it's that holistic approach. So, if you do this at 30 cents on the dollar, who's going to attack you in the house? Do they have caveatable interests? Is the business actually survivable on the back of this. You know, we're seeing an extraordinary amount of people who want to do the right thing, which is actually really good. You know, as an Australian citizen, I'm really happy that we've got business owners that want to do the right thing. But by doing the right thing, if it actually compromises a director more than they otherwise would,
yeah,
that sometimes you've actually got to sit down and go, stop. You know, the amount of times I've seen directors destroy their personal life to try and save their business, it's unfortunately horrendous. So making sure that you look at it fully and completely is actually critical.
And I know oftentimes, Ashley, we have to combine different strategies. That a debt restructure might go hand in hand with a personal asset protection strategy to just get the best outcome for the director.
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, while we're talking a little bit about the real world, what are some of the other issues to consider in small business debt restructures?
Well, as we said, many of the creditors don't exercise their vote.
Yeah.
So in the real world, the ATO generally always does at the moment. So, and even though the debt is under $1 million, the ATO is a significant part of, or is often the single largest creditor in all of these cases, and can represent 50% of the vote in and of itself. So the ATO has a major influence on whether these things are going to work or not.
And they are going to show up, right? Do we have any idea what the ATO's position on debt restructures has been so far?
Look, there's no written policy that says this is what they are and aren't going to do.
They won't even answer it verbally when we ask them.
A couple of months ago, no, we couldn't get a straight answer out of them. But the anecdotal evidence, and I guess the rumours and the experiences that we're seeing, is that, I mean, they do have a division that they've created specifically to look at this. So there is a group of people that are dealing with it. And given that it was a legislation brought in by the government to help small business, they do seem to be playing along, and they do seem to be supportive. As I said earlier, you know, 27 of the 33 got up last year in 2021. A large percentage of them are still getting up this year. So that would indicate that they're playing the game and they're continuing to support a business. But what it often comes down to, we understand, is, you know, the longevity. Are they going to be able to continue to meet their requirements moving forward? Have they been historically really, really bad? You know, and ignoring every payment plan known to man. So there's all those types of things that will probably get taken into account.
Someone knows your name at the ATO, it's not always a good thing, hey? All right, Ashley. So small business debt restructuring, or as we like to call it, the ALDI docker, like a deed of company arrangement with some really important differences. As you say, an important tool in the toolkit and certainly growing in popularity in recent months. I'll make you play devil's advocate here for a minute though, mate. And can you give me an example of a situation where I may not want to use this at all?
Well, even in a small debt situation, like if you've got significant related party debts, writing those off and not having them available to vote may not actually be the smartest way to do a debt restructure, and actually using a voluntary administration process where you've got the votes there may actually be a more important way or a better way to do things. The other thing is actually compromising the debts. Is it actually going to make the position better long term?
Yeah.
Like what we're seeing again, you know, the Australian business community are quite optimistic and want to do the right thing. But sometimes we're actually better off just shutting down rather than compromising. So just doing a controlled exit of the business rather than actually trying to compromise and then move on. And the other is business restructures that we talk about all the time may actually be a better long-term option than dealing with the legacy and the ongoing cash flow of it.
Okay. Well, look, thanks for that, Ashley. That's all the questions and the grilling I had for you today. I hope our audience found that interesting. And did you have any last thoughts for us before we close off our session this morning?
Yeah, well, look, as I said, as I've said all the way through this, I think the critical thing for everyone to understand is it is a valuable tool that we can use at the right time, but this has a lot more hairs on it than people are promoting out in the marketplace at the moment. It doesn't have the hairs in the tiny little corner that it's in, but when you look at the totality of it, it's a little bit more complicated and has some more risks. So please be aware of that. Get that independent advice. Obviously, we would love you to call us and our strategists, but if it's, that independent advice is the critical thing. The other thing I wanted to, we have a webinar in December, but for everyone, please be aware when the invite comes out, for the first time in 22 months or however long we've been doing this, it will be on a Wednesday, so not on the Thursday. The final thing for everyone who's been a regular attender and has enjoyed the banter between Phil and I have the unfortunate unfortunate pleasure of advising that Phil has actually decided that he's had enough of dealing with me, and he's actually going into retirement. He's sick of picking on me for the last 2 years, or the last 12 or 13 years he's been with us here at Jonge. So this will be Phil's last AM webinar. He's got one more to do this afternoon. So from Hank and I, Phil, thank you very much for your on-air and off-air entertainment that you and guidance that you provided our business over the years. We're very lucky that you've spent a number of months training our new compliance manager, John Palumo, who's coming in. But thank you, and I've really enjoyed the on-air banter that's come with all of this. So, last thing on the screen there, you'll see the poll. So that's about what I had to wrap up. I'll hand over to you again, Phil, if you wanted to say something on your way out the door.
I'd just like to say that it's been a pleasure to be involved in these webinars, and I really hope our audience have found it interesting. It's been a new thing for Jonge, and hopefully it's allowed us to reach out to more people and encourage their clients to get that independent advice that Ashley and I just think is so critical. So I came in after Ashley got these things up and running just to torment him a little bit, and it's been a lot of fun, and it's been a big part of my working life for the last 2 and a bit years. So thank you all for coming along to our webinars and listening to me rabbit on.
And I guess we should do what we always do, Phil, and say, are there any questions? So
Any questions?
It's time to pick on Phil Day.
Pick on Phil Day.
All right, that looks like it's it. So if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to pick up the phone or emailing us or talk to any of our strategist team. But thank you again for joining us. We'll see you for our December webinar for those who are coming back. And Phil, thank you very much. Enjoy retirement, buddy.
Thank you.
Enjoy the golf courses around Australia and the world as you go along.
And thank you to all the kind messages in our chat too. I do appreciate it.
Excellent. Awesome.
Thanks,
thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.